Good evening and welcome. We are the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area, and this is the second session in our Good Government series. I am Kirsten Abrahamson, Director of Advocacy and Chair of the Redistricting Group. Before we get started, I would like to address a few housekeeping items. Please mute yourselves and keep yourselves on mute during the presentations. Please turn off your video to focus on our panelists. And we are live streaming on Facebook, and the recording will be available on our Facebook page at LWV Charleston. Please hold all questions until the end of the presentation and submit them in the chat box. We will take questions as time permits. Welcome to Redistricting. I'd like to thank our collaborators, and we have a lot of them, the League of Women Voters of South Carolina, and we have a number of our local leagues, the Charleston area, Clemson area, Columbia area, Florence area, Greenville County, Hilton Head Island, Bluffton area, Spartanburg County. We have thanks go out to College of Charleston Political Science Department, Women in Leadership, Berkeley Chamber of Commerce, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, ACLU South Carolina, South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs, and South Carolina Interfaith Power and Light and Sustaining Way. And I'd like to send a big thank you to our league members who have helped put this event together. Barbara Griffin, Barbara Zia, Leslie Scarden, Sarah Johnson, Shayna Howell, and many others. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization which encourages informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We are honored to bring you this nonpartisan Good Government Symposium series, promoting education and awareness relating to critical good government issues that impact national, state, and local governance. If you were able to join us, you know that we had our first event, which focused on voting rights. If you missed it, you can go to our Facebook videos. Our Facebook page is LWV Charleston, and you can view that event there. Tonight, we will be hearing from experts in the field of redistricting. And we have 3 events following tonight's event. On April 12th, we will be focusing on the Electoral College and institutional reforms. On May 10th, we will be focusing on dark money and transparency. And on June 7th, elections and voting systems and approaches. Mark your calendars for Monday, April 12th, and we'd love to have you join us again. And please go to our website at lwvcharleston.org and sign up for the newsletter to get information on all of these future sessions. Tonight, our featured presentation is on redistricting. We will explore the impact of redistricting on our democratic process and look at best practices that will keep our maps from being gerrymandered. We will cover the basics in a Redistricting 101. We will learn about the state's redistricting process from a state senator, and then wrap up the evening with a conversation with a mapping expert on state and local considerations. So let me begin by introducing our guests for the evening. Tonight, we will be hearing from, as our keynote speaker, Ruth Greenwood. She is the co-director of voting rights and redistricting for the Campaign Legal Center and will offer a Redistricting 101. We will also be hearing from our State Senator Chip Campson, who will highlight the state process and General Assembly's role in redistricting. And lastly, we will meet Dr. John Roof, principal with the Roof Group, who is an expert in mapping and analysis and will shed a light on the state and local redistricting process. So let me tell you a bit more about our keynote speaker, Ruth Greenwood. Ruth serves as the co-director of Voting Rights and Redistricting for the Campaign Legal Center. She has been working in voting rights for over 10 years. Ruth litigates a variety of redistricting cases with a particular focus on ending partisan gerrymandering and promoting minority representation. Ruth litigated 2 partisan gerrymandering cases from the trial level to the Supreme Court of the United States, Whitford v. Gill and the League of Women Voters of North Carolina v. Rucho, and has advised dozens of states on how to draft and implement independent redistricting commissions. Ruth, I welcome you to join us.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you all for having me today. I know I'm not actually in Charleston, though I would love to be, but I have visited and I loved it. You can hear I grew up in Australia, in Sydney, which is a harbour city. And so I was very impressed with Charleston, that you are also a harbour city. And obviously a lot warmer. I'm now up in the Boston area, which is very cold. Okay, I'm not sure if I can control these slides, so I might just say next.
Yes, next will work. Thank you.
Thanks. So I am Ruth, and I run the Voting Rights and Redistricting group at the Campaign Legal Center. You'll see here some of my colleagues stretched a little thin. The Campaign Legal Center has been around since 2002, I guess, which means it's nearly 20 years old. And we work in the areas of campaign finance, ethics, voting rights, and redistricting. And in all of those areas, actually, we work pretty closely with the League of Women Voters, mostly because you guys are on the ground across the country everywhere. You know, if somebody calls me up and says, I want to know what's happening somewhere, my first call is to a local league chapter or the National League to say, who's your local person and who can tell me what's happening. So I have really appreciated working with you all for many years. And the Campaign Legal Center try to just be the lawyers. You guys do organizing and advocacy and education and a million other things. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Thank you. What is redistricting? So I framed these in a series of questions that Kirsten gave to me because I actually think that they were a very clever way to go through and discuss the basics plus, right? You guys clearly are an educated group. And so this is a little deeper than I would usually go with first timers. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. The first thing to know about redistricting is that you have to know what reapportionment is. So you may have all been aware of and been involved in the process to get out the count last year. So in the 0 year, there is a census in this country. And this shows you actually from UNC. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have done that. I'm not sure about the rivalry or love between North and South Carolina. But anyway, this is a nice chart that they produced in any case. We expect to get the reapportionment data, which basically means how many people are there in each state. We expect to get that by the end of April. Usually we would have that at the end of December. And so basically January 1, we would know how many seats each state will have in Congress. This projection thinks that South Carolina won't be changing, but you can see basically the South and the West are gaining population and the Midwest and the sort of Rust Belt are losing population, which means you get more seats moving, to the South. The reason it's been so delayed this time is, well, mostly because of COVID, right? They usually do the initial response, and people respond online or by paper, and they expect to get about 2/3 of the country that way, which they did. But to get from that sort of 66% up to about 96%, that extra 30% takes a lot of door knocking. And that was something that was not very welcome while everyone was quarantining and not wanting to open the door to, well, anyone, let alone strangers. And so it's taken a little longer to get to the apportionment numbers. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So once the apportionment numbers come out, so that's April, we then know how many US House seats all of the states have. They then, Census Bureau has to release what gets called the 94-171 file, because it was the 94th Congress in the 1970s that passed it. But it essentially gives you how many people there are down to the census block level. So blocks can have no people in them. They can have 1 or 2. They can have like 900 if they're, sometimes college dorms will have a lot of people. Prisons will have a lot of people, big apartment blocks. But usually you sort of imagine there's 5 to 10 people in many of the census blocks. So the reason we need that is because of in the 1960s, when the Supreme Court elucidated the principle of one person, one vote, it became clear that when you draw initially congressional, but then also state house and Senate and local districts, that you need to have the same number of people in each of those districts. And you won't be able to work that out unless you have this data telling us how many people there are all over the state. If we can go to the next slide. So one of the most important things to understand with redistricting is who is responsible for it. And the one of the people who used to sort of be an expert, frankly, gerrymanderer in the past, would say, look, if you don't think it's important who draws the maps, just let me draw them. It's cool. Which I think shows you the importance of it, right? So here I've put at the top the sort of ideal where we have independent commissions. So I know that there have been proposals in South Carolina for independent commissions that haven't managed to get through. There have been proposals in many of the states that have ballot initiatives to get independent commissions. And that means that you get regular citizens signing up and then sort of picked out of a hat. And then they decide, well, where should we draw the boundaries, with the idea that they are disinterested. They're not like, I want to draw, my biggest campaign donor into my district, or, I must have this side of the river because, I know I've got great voters there. So that's independent commissions. And then we sort of fall back on the less good ones. So political or bipartisan commissions, generally, political, they just appoint people, but we worry that the people that get appointed are beholden to the person who appointed them. Bipartisan commissions, you often end up with very uncompetitive maps. So you get a bunch of R's and a bunch of D's, and they decide which seats they want. And there's maybe 1 or 2 swing districts, and everything else is kind of locked up. I lived for many years in Illinois, where we would often have pretty uncompetitive districts, partly because of this process. Then there are advisory commissions, which in most places are not helpful because they give advice and then the legislature promptly ignores it. But one of the best examples of how redistricting can work well is actually Iowa, where they have an advisory commission made up of the state demographer and some statistics folk, and they put together a plan. And the political culture of the state is for them to always adopt whatever is proposed by the advisory commission, which is phenomenal, but also very hard to replicate in other states, because in other states, you get an advisory commission and the legislature says, no thanks, and does their own gerrymander. And then, of course, there's the legislature. Now, sometimes legislatures try to do some good things, but usually the self-interest gets them, and they work out a way to make sure that themselves as people or their party are advantaged as compared to the other party. We even saw this last decade in New York, where I can't remember, one was, Democrats were in control of the House and Republicans in the Senate, or vice versa. And so they just gerrymandered one each way, and they all agreed to pass each other's gerrymander. So it's not like you get both of them gerrymandered the same way, but that leads to really uncompetitive districts and voters essentially not having a say. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this just shows you a website which is run by a professor, Justin Levitt. It's called All About Redistricting. If you Google All About Redistricting, you will come up with this page. So this shows you who has control. So we see here for South Carolina, for example, that the legislature is in control of congressional redistricting. If we go to the next slide, please. This is legislative redistricting. So you might notice a slight difference. There are a couple more places that have these yellow independent or even political commissions for legislative districting. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. If we could just go to the next slide. So why should people care about redistricting? Let's go ahead to the next slide. The main reason that you should care about redistricting, aside from being people that care about democracy, right? I care about it because I think that we should have this sort of equitable democracy, and many of you may think that. But really, the long-term effects are that all policies are affected by redistricting. I have a friend in the redistricting space who likes to say, I don't need you to care about redistricting most, but I need you to care about it first, right? Let's get the redistricting rules set up so we can set a playing field that is somewhat even between, you know, voters electing legislators. Not that both sides should have equal numbers. If one side is more popular, they should get more, but it shouldn't be the case that if one side is more popular, they get less seats than the other side. And once that happens, they get into power and they go ahead and make all of the rules, you know, by which we live. So if we could go to the next slide. I pulled out from this website that I'm involved with called Plan Score, 2 of the pages. On the left, you'll see it says the 2012 to 2018 redistricting plan, and the highlight sort of blue is US House. And so this shows you that the House plan in South Carolina looks to have a very large advantage for the Republican Party. So for the last decade, you have had a US House plan with a big advantage. Now, I will note that when you have a small number of districts like South Carolina, you tend to get bigger percentages. If you convert that into seats, it's only sort of 1 or 2 seats. Whereas in California, if you converted 16% into seats, it would be like, I don't know, 10 seats. So, but still, that suggests a pretty big advantage for Republicans in the congressional plan. If we look on the right-hand side, I pulled up the state House plan for South Carolina, and that shows a modest advantage for Republicans, but nothing that we would think of as being outside of the historical norm, right? It's about 4%. Most discussions about where we should set the limit is at probably about 6 or 7 or 8%. So you can have a place like South Carolina where you have a modest advantage, but, you know, sort of fair on one side, and then this extreme advantage on the other side. It just depends a little bit on who was drawing and what deals were drawn up. So this is part of the why should we care? I care because I think that both voters from both parties should be treated equally. And that line in the middle, that 0 line, would be where Democratic and Republican voters would be able to translate their votes into seats with equal ease. If we could go to I'll show you later some examples historically of both sides gerrymandering. I do just want to share this one story because Wendy Sue Johnson is here. She was one of our plaintiffs in the Whitford litigation that I did. This is the map on the right that we sued over. It was the state assembly plan. Wendy Sue is a good League of Women Voters member. She was a teacher and had been on her local school board up in the northeast of the state in Eau Claire. And until 2011, so in the previous decade, in her area, it's fairly Republican. She's a Democrat, but they basically would send mostly Republicans, some Democrats, into the state assembly. And the group in that area from like 3 or 4 of the counties, because they're relatively rural compared to the rest of the state, would get together with the legislators, all the school boards, and then the legislators, and they'd say, okay, what do you want us to advocate for you down in Madison, the capital? And so the school board would talk about what their various priorities were and sort of speak with their legislators. And then as soon as what I would describe as the gerrymander passed in 2011, and they get this new plan, the legislators just stopped the meetings. There was this sense of like, I don't need your votes. It doesn't matter to me if, you know, you go around telling everybody I'm terrible, because the seats were drawn in such a way as to be so safe. And there was one Democrat and then a whole bunch of Republicans, and both of them were incredibly safe, and they just didn't care anymore. It was like, I don't need to worry about your policies. And so even though, you know, it can seem a little wonky, like, where are we drawing these lines? The real world effects were, she was like, well, what's the point of being on this school board? No, I mean, she could do things locally, but she couldn't get the attention of the people down in the state capitol to try to get more resources for her area. And so she took up, you know, more and more advocacy with various groups. Okay, so that's why you should care about it. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, why is redistricting controversial? This is kind of wacky. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is something that I always have on a wall near me when I do my work, to remind me that even though I delve into the numbers and the this and the that, and sometimes as well, even when I work with, one woman in the middle of northeastern, Wisconsin, I like to remind myself that the work that I'm doing is about building power. When we set up a democracy, it is about distributing power. And at the moment, the people that end up in the capitals have a lot of power, and the voters out there don't have so much power. Now, and then there's also the problem that between the voters, some of the voters, say the ones that can donate more money, or the ones that live in districts, where their vote, quote unquote, counts compared to another area, have more power. And so I like to remind myself that these things are controversial because we are talking about power. So, at the moment, I'm doing a lot of discussions with people about what language should be used to change redistricting if HR1 and S1, the For the People Act, passes. And there's always this distress around redistricting, because taking power, putting power in the hands of independent commissions or real citizens around the country, really freaks out a lot of people, a lot of legislators, because it's almost like they know the game's rigged, but so long as they understand in what ways the game is rigged, they're happy to kind of stick with that system. Whereas setting it up to a fair process means they're losing power. So why are these things controversial? That, I think, is the first reason, because we're talking about power. And then here's the, go to the next slide. This is John Oliver, and this is my wedding cake. So let me explain this. Nick is my husband. He is also a redistricting nerd. When we were talking about getting married, one of our professors said, "Oh, what's this going to be? Nick and Ruth combining communities of interest." And I was like, "That's so hilarious. Like, even if nobody else gets it, we're going to do this." And so we put our favorite congressional district on a cake. Now, it turns out this district we love for a very specific reason, which I hadn't sort of thought through, that nobody gets it when they look at this. A lot of people look at this and they say, "Gee, that's a gerrymander." Even, the people that I work with at CLC will say, "Oh, should we get your gerrymandered cake out?" And I'm like, it's not a gerrymander. Even though it looks weird, this district is so great because it was drawn very specifically to enfranchise communities. I'm going to talk about it a little later, but I'll give you a preview. Northwest side of Chicago, historically Puerto Rican. Southwest side of Chicago, this is in the city of Chicago, is kind of in the middle. Southwest side of Chicago, historically Mexican American. This district means you can draw a district that allows the Latino voters of Illinois to elect a candidate of choice to Congress for the first time. In fact, this district was drawn by a court in the 1990s. And it also means you don't have to break up the district that's in the middle, because if you drew the line like a barbell down the middle, you would break up a majority Black district that was electing a candidate of choice of the Black community. So why do these things get controversial? Well, when you start talking about, the Mexican American community and the Puerto Rican community and the Black community, and where are the white voters? And you start talking about race in this country, obviously everyone freaks out. And we have controversies over how should we be drawing the edges of our districts, who should normatively, right, be in a district, and who should be outside. And if we have to make a decision as to where we cut off the boundaries, what should be our sort of decision rule for making that choice? And obviously John Oliver thought this was hilarious, put it on his show, and now that's a thing that happened to me. Okay, next question. How did redistricting in 2010 remake the political landscape? So this is where I wanted to go to the next slide and then to the next one, and kind of back and forth between the two so you can see. If we could go to the next one first. So this is, again, is from PlanScore. This is the full map of the country. Now, some of these are too small. They only have one district, or I don't think we include things with less than 6. So you'll see here at the top, along the top is a timeline. This is highlighting 2012. So the reason for the little dots in between is sometimes maps get struck down in between decades and there are new maps. So a good example is North Carolina. Basically every 2 years, there's like a new map in North Carolina when they have another one struck down. So this shows you it's pretty red, right? Historically, the effect of after 2010 was to have a lot of pro-Republican gerrymanders drawn. If we can go to the next slide. This shows you 1982, and you'll see here, there are a whole lot of places with Democratic gerrymanders. I think actually the California gerrymander is one of the single worst ones. And that was partly what sent Ronald Reagan nuts, right? So he used to have all these quotes in the 1980s talking about how unfair it was that more people voted for Republicans, yet California continued to send more Democrats to Congress. You know, then you fast forward 30 years and suddenly it's, you know, Barack Obama complaining that exactly that happened. And so this just gives you a sense of historically, both sides have done this. Even at the moment, there are both sides doing it, but in the 2010 round, there were more Republicans doing it. My guess is in 2020, if nothing changes, if we don't get HR1 or don't get any more commissions, that there's going to be still probably a couple more Republican gerrymanders, but there are going to be some pretty severe Democratic ones as well. And that, to me, just means that voters lose out. You know, you're getting these gerrymanders that stitch up the results ahead of time, which is a shame. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Thank you. What techniques are used to gerrymander districts? You may know this, or you may not, but I'll go through it for you. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, please. So this is the one you probably know. On the left here is Elbridge Gerry. He was governor of actually the state where I live now, Massachusetts. And he wanted to make sure that he had a particular senator elected from from many of the districts, but in particular from this area. So I don't know if you recognize any of these names. I mean, I live here and I barely recognize them, but like Salem Witch Trials, you might see at the bottom where one of the feet is, Salem, Marblehead. Anyway, so this district was drawn, and then a local newspaper threw on some wings and claws and said, gee, it really looks like a salamander. So it was Elbridge Gerry's salamander, which became gerrymandering, somewhat confusingly. So that's what the term is. The reason to have this actual picture there is because back then we didn't have kind of all the math, we didn't have the data processing skills that we have now with computers. And so we weren't able as easily to add up all the numbers and say, oh, this is a gerrymander because of, you know, we think this many people will vote this way and this many people will vote that way. And that's why one side has an advantage. You could look at this and be like, the shape is funny. It seems like something's going on here. But today you can actually hide gerrymanders in plain sight. And so I like to remember that it really did come from these strange shapes, but today I don't think strange shapes are a problem in and of themselves. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, oh, sorry, I've put this as like, click again, please. Okay, this is just setting us up with a nice square state with 20 blue voters and 25 red voters. I actually have slightly darker red and blue as incumbents. I didn't include, so strictly speaking, the ways that you can gerrymander are cracking, packing, stacking, tacking, hijacking, and kidnapping. But that's obviously ridiculous. I can send you the report, you can read them, you can learn them. I'm just gonna go over packing and cracking today, which are the main ways. So this essentially shows you, okay, we've got some people, they're distributed. How could we draw, you know, what we might call a neutral plan? So if we could click again. So this, you know, you say, okay, great. Look, we've got one incumbent in each district. We've got 2 districts where the blue voters are choosing someone. We've got 3 districts where the red voters are choosing someone. You know, it's not exactly, you know, proportional representation. The blue voters are 44%. They're getting 40% of the seats. The red voters are 56%. They're getting 60%. But it's something we could probably all live with, right? This seems reasonably fair. If we could go to the next slide, please. So cracking and packing is, this just includes the example of the the red gerrymander. You can do these in multiple ways. So here, what you do most is you pack your opponents into one little district. So see District 1 there, you put as many blue dots together, including as many incumbents as you can, into the one district. So whoever wins there is going to win with an overwhelming margin. And so there's all of these voters that are not contributing their votes to a winner. They're just, I mean, it's like 90% of the people are voting. I guess it's 80 for the winner. And that means you can crack all the blue voters at the edge, crack them between the other districts. And so you don't have another blue district, you have 4 red districts. And so that is packing into you know, these 90-10 districts. And then the cracking is usually like 55-45 districts. You know, a 5% swing can be pretty unusual. You might make them 57-43 if you really think there's going to be a 7% swing, but usually about a 55% district is reasonably safe. I will point out another reason why this works today in a way that it didn't back in 1812 when the original gerrymander was drawn. is not only because of our data analytics skills with computers, it's also because we are more polarized as a country. So, I mean, even in the 1990s, I grew up thinking, wow, America is so cool for many reasons. But one in particular was that you would have people from states that were rural, and they might have been Ds and Rs, but they would vote together on like the farm bill. And then you would have people who were Ds and Rs from cities, and they would vote together because they had other things in common. And so it wasn't always like the Ds do one thing, the Rs do another. These days, they're very split. They do their own things, and people are very split as well. They're not like, maybe I like this about that person and that about that person. There are some swing voters, right? Maybe even 10%. But the vast majority of people are pretty clearly a D or an R. And so when you look at a map like this, you'd probably have to put a couple in here that are like green, like we don't know what they're going to do. But so long as you submerge them into a district that's very clearly blue or very clearly red, then the people who swing their vote get ignored. And we know that the red and the blue voters are just going to keep selecting exactly who they want every time. And so that's the effectiveness of gerrymandering, like harnessing not just the data, but also the fact of polarization to be able to implement a plan that will stay pretty solid for 10 years. Okay, next slide, please. How does the VRA impact redistricting? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this, firstly, I wanted to show you again, this delightful Illinois 4th Congressional District from my wedding cake. The Voting Rights Act there are many, okay, I'm going to get into Section 5 and pre-clearance later. I'm just going to talk about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act here, which since 1982 has essentially said, if you can draw a district that is majority minority, then you have to draw it, provided there is polarization in voting. So like if there's no polarization, if white and black people say, vote for the same candidates, well, then it doesn't matter whether you draw a majority minority district or not. That's not an important cleavage. But so long as you have white voters voting one way and black voters voting another way, or you could have, white and Asian voters voting one way, or you could have, black and Asian one way and white the other way, whatever the coalitions are, so long as there's these two, like, one group prefers one set of candidates and the other group prefers a different set of candidates, then the minority group, if you can draw a 50% district, the Voting Rights Act says that you have to do that in order to ensure that that community can elect a candidate of choice. So that's kind of where the Voting Rights Act comes in. If we could go to the next slide. I wanted to put in the sort of prohibition on racial gerrymandering. So what happened in this originally started in the 90s, but in the 2010 round of districting out of Alabama, the legislature there said, because under, because of the Voting Rights Act, we are going to draw districts. And it was slightly confused because Section 5 was involved, but they basically said, look, whatever the percentage of the district was in the last cycle, we're going to keep it exactly the same. So it was like, this district had 63% black population. We're going to keep putting people in until we get to exactly 63% black. So like the example here is this blue, light blue precinct at the top. I'm sorry. There's the blue is a district, even though it's splitting a precinct. So you see they took people from the precinct that are green, which I guess in this case are racial minorities, and they put them all into that blue district at the top, regardless of the precinct line. And then even though there are sort of white voters still in the precinct, they cut them out. And this is one, and this case, this Middle District of Alabama from 2017 is like hundreds and hundreds of pages with lots and lots of these diagrams, sorry about my dog, where they go through and look at each case to say, well, are you making this decision entirely based on race? And the Supreme Court has said, look, you can't just like pick a quota and stick to it. You can't just say, it needs to be 63%. They've even said you can't just say it needs to be 50%. Even though to sue, you need a 50% district. If you are drawing a plan and you can see that a community is enfranchised when they have a 45% district, because there's some white crossover voting or other crossover voting, then you can draw that district, but you have to look at it. They call it an intensely local appraisal. And so the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, because it requires nuance, I think sometimes people find it overwhelming or scary, or they just want to check the whole thing out. But I hope that you can appreciate that it is obviously historically very important to enfranchise communities of colour, but also the actual requirements from the law are just that you understand the community and try to draw districts to enfranchise minorities, which I think is a good thing, not only for racial and ethnic minorities, but for all sorts of minorities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. How does the lack of pre-clearance impact districts? So pre-clearance used to be required under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So this was introduced in 1965. I remember when I heard about this, I was like, you can do that? That is so clever. Like, they basically said to certain places that had a history of discrimination, you don't get to just start changing your election laws when you want to. You have to actually get it pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or a DC District Court. Now, I think that there are probably more places in the country than just the South that had these sort of pretty discriminatory paths, but for a long time, having Section 5 in place meant that you couldn't like suddenly switch a polling place over to the other side of the tracks and, you know, make people of color walk across the tracks into the white neighborhood to vote. But it also meant that when you drew districts, if there was a district that was working to enfranchise a community of color, you couldn't just dismantle it. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to show you just these two pictures of North Carolina. So on the left shows you the 2012 plan. And so you'll see, well, I don't know, depends how much you know, but so the I-85 corridor from Greensboro to Charlotte essentially got understood as a community in the 1990s by the court. And they said, look, we need to draw a district along here that is majority minority. It doesn't need to be like extensive, let's pack every Black person we can find in here, but this is a community that votes together and we need to keep it. But then in 2016, by the time that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act had been struck down, that district was completely redrawn. Now, it actually did keep electing a candidate of choice of the Black community down in Charlotte, but it's now a 36% Black district. And so like there's enough crossover voting from white voters, but it's questionable whether, you know, if you had a Section 5 in place, it seems as though it would be hard to completely dismantle that district. Whereas now that we don't have pre-clearance anymore, that will have an effect. And so that will be similar in South Carolina, where you have a district that is currently electing a candidate of choice of the Black community to Congress, and also multiple districts like that in the State House and Senate. You will no longer have to use what's called non-retrogression standard, which was that, you know, you can't dismantle something once it's there. You just have to use that standard that I mentioned from Section 2, where if you can, you know, draw a district to enfranchise the minority community, then you should draw it. Okay, let's go to the next one. Slide. Okay, what are different solutions to make districting more fair? Okay, we'll go with this. This is the second last question. So here's that. If we can go to the next slide, please. The thing I think for fairness is to think about three things. Who are the people doing it? What powers do they have? And what process do they use? So the people, the easiest way to improve fairness is to have an independent commission. Now, you can have it in different ways. You can have, you know, some citizens, some legislators. You can have completely by lottery. You can have all R's and D's. You can have R's, D's, and none of the above. There are different ways of forming them, but I generally think getting it out of the hands of legislators, not that all legislators are bad, but historically, generally taking it out of the hands of legislators leads to more fair plans in terms of partisan fairness. Now, what are the powers? So even if you still have the legislature in control, you can limit the bounds under which they may draw plans. So you can add in additional protections for communities of color beyond the Voting Rights Act. You can have a partisan fairness criteria. You could require competitiveness in districts. You can require respect for communities of interest. Each of these things will get you different sorts of outcomes. And if you're writing a list, you know, usually I would sit down with the community and say, go through each of these and talk about, you know, are these important things, you know, in this state or in this area? And inevitably, different states have different things that are more and less important. And so it's one of those things where you need to sort of think about what's right for your state. And then the last thing for improving fairness is the process. So, you know, even if you have legislators doing everything and they can draw it totally to advantage themselves, you can still improve fairness by having public hearings, you know, shining light on what's happening, getting the media involved, making sure the data is available online so that the league can download the data and draw their own plans and submit them. Make sure that there are draft maps that are released for discussion, so you can talk about, well, if you do this is going to be the effect of that, and this is why I do or don't want you to do that. I'll just give a quick example. When the California Commission released its draft plans in 2010, somebody from the LA area appeared before the commission and said, look, I'm from Koreatown and I'm never going to have a majority minority district. So this is not like a Voting Rights Act compliance thing. She said, it's just that I don't want to have like 3 different legislators for my community to go to. So can you change the district so that all of Koreatown gets kept together? And you can imagine lots of other local things like that where, if somebody's drawing the lines and doesn't know those particular local concerns, they could easily miss something. And so having the draft maps released provides an important tool for people to have a voice. Okay. Go to the next slide. I think this is the last question. How can people have their voices heard in redistricting? First up, so we'll go to the next slide. Of course, getting educated about it. So well done. You all win on that. This is a front page of a report that we released with the National League of Women Voters called Designing a Transparent and Ethical Redistricting Process. And so we have this little set of recommendations at the end. Again, I can send the link around. But it essentially goes through what commissioners, but also, legislators should do. So yeah, draft maps and reports should be released on a publicly accessible website. Hearings should be subject to FOIA and public records request meetings and so on. So you can look into that in more detail, but basically turning up and telling the media what's happening is a good, initial step to get involved. Okay, sorry, I've taken a little bit more time, I think, than I was allotted, but I appreciate you allowing me.
You're okay. You want to speak to your last slide?
So this is just redistricting and campaignlegal.org goes to my whole team. So then even if somebody's really busy on something, hopefully, we're happy to get in touch. So you can get in touch with us through the league or just, directly through that website or go to our website. I'm always happy to talk about redistricting.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth. And we're hoping you will stay with us. I am going to stop the sharing of the PowerPoint, and we're going to find out if our next speaker is to be Senator Campson. And we want to confirm that he's here on our vast screen of many faces. Senator Campson, are you with us? Well, I think we're going to, if we don't hear from Senator Campson here in the next minute or so, I am going to shift gears into introducing John Roof. And if Senator Campson can join us after John's presentation, that would be terrific. So we're going to go ahead here. So what was to be our final guest of the evening is Dr. John Roof, and John is going to answer some questions for us. But first, let me tell you more about John. John is principal of the Roof Group, a research and policy analysis firm. He has been engaged in drawing districting maps since the days of paper maps and magic markers. I don't think he goes back as far as gerrymandering was originated, but I'll let him speak to that. He has assisted community groups, school boards, county councils, legislators, and special redistricting committees to prepare and evaluate districting plan proposals from boards of public works to the United States Congress, including during the past 3 rounds of statewide redistricting. He has appeared as an expert witness or submitted expert reports regarding racial block voting, racial disparities in socioeconomic indicators, Southern history, and line drawing in redistricting and voting rights and litigation since the 1980s. He is the co-author of A History of Voting Rights in South Carolina, 1982 to 2006. And John is also a member of our State League Redistricting Group. So we're going to ask John a few questions. And we're going to start with John. Do you want to say hi so everyone knows which one you are?
I am this one.
Okay, great. And amongst the many faces here. So John, we're going to start by asking you if you can tell us how South Carolina compares to other states when it comes to fair maps.
Well, if you look at ugly maps, which is the way many people evaluate whether we have gerrymandered maps. Not bad. I have a collection of what Holly Albrecht calls my redistricting porn slides that if we'd had more time, I might have shown, and we don't have any that look like that. You know, even those who are deeply offended by the 6th congressional district, it just isn't all that bad in comparison. In terms of partisan bias, you know, there is an issue around the congressional districts, although remember that was somewhat solved in 2018 by just winning one of those districts. In the House and Senate districts, Matt Saltzman, who is on the line, and his graduate students up at Clemson have evaluated the 2010 districts, and their conclusion is that they certainly are not outliers when it comes to partisan bias. They're sort of in the range of the fixed Pennsylvania districts after their successful litigation there. I think what you find more in South Carolina that leads to issues and problems is what's called sweetheart gerrymandering, which is to say they looked out for the incumbents.
Okay, well, thank you for that. You've sort of started to talk about this, but is South Carolina's redistricting process unique? Is there anything that you can add to what Ruth has already shared with us just about Redistricting 101 that might be more specific to South Carolina?
Well, I mean, the thing to keep in mind in South Carolina is that we have none of those fancy new progressive kinds of ways to draw lines. The legislature draws the lines. You know, the Senate draws the Senate lines, the House draws the House lines, and because of mutually assured destruction, they don't mess with one another's lines, and they fight over the congressional districts. But the General Assembly draws the lines.
Okay, thank you. What is the likelihood that South Carolina could move to one of those other fancy models that you just referenced? And what would it take? Like, for example, independent commissions was one of the ones that Ruth had highlighted. What would it take for South Carolina to move to an independent commission? And I know other states, South Carolina doesn't have a citizen-led ballot initiative option, but other states have maybe gone that route to achieve one of these alternatives.
Right. I mean, democracy has always been illegal in South Carolina. And so we don't have citizen ballot opportunities to bring a citizens or an independent redistricting committee. The only other possibility would be is if it got to be enough of a pain in the neck to legislators having to hear about their drawing their own districts that they finally said, enough, we're a long way from that.
Okay. And we are hoping you could also shed light on local redistricting. Obviously, we know that there's state and House and US congressional, but redistricting affects county councils, city and towns, school boards. That's
and even boards of public works.
Yeah, yes, the special interest. So could you speak to that?
Yes, I mean, these folks redistrict on the same schedule more or less as the General Assembly. And so those that have single member districts, and that's the most of them in South Carolina now, will be entering into a redistricting process over the next couple of years. I mean, clearly this year we have the issue, we have a whole raft of municipalities that are scheduled to hold elections in November. But if the data doesn't get to us until September, then there's really not time to do the public hearings, do the do the 3 readings, seriously consider maps, and have candidates file for those positions. So those municipalities are facing the question of, do we go forward using the old lines, or do we move the elections out until a later date? And at this point, I don't think we have any clear direction on that from which municipalities will do what. If they linger long enough, there's also, you can always, somebody can always bring a 1 person, 1 vote lawsuit challenging the malapportionment of those districts if they don't change them.
John, I'm going to beg your forgiveness here, but I've been alerted that Senator Campson has been able to join us now. And since I know we have some slides that are included in your presentation, we are going to shift to Senator Campson and come back to you since we're doing a great Q&A. But thank you so much for jumping in. And I am going to next introduce Senator Campson. Thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate you being here. So if you give me a minute, well, thank you. If you give me a minute, I'm going to just give a little introduction for you. So State Senator Chip Campson is an attorney and businessman who has served in the South Carolina State Senate since 2004. A 5th-generation Charlestonian, his District 43 covers almost half of South Carolina's coast. He is chairman of the Senate Fish, Game, and Forestry Committee, and also serves on the Judiciary, Rules, Transportation, and Legislative Oversight Committees. He serves as chairman of the Charleston County Legislative Delegation, vice chairman of the Beaufort County Legislative Delegation, Senate Religious Liberty Caucus, and the Senate Sportsman's Caucus. He is former chairman of the South Carolina Judicial Merit Selection Commission. And as we've just been talking about, the legislature in South Carolina is responsible for both the U.S. congressional and state legislative redistricting. We are honored to have Senator Campson share the legislative role in this redistricting process. Senator Campson, welcome. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you. This will be the 3rd redistricting I've been involved in. I served in the House prior to the Senate. I had a period of time where a break between the 2, but I did reapportionment or was involved in the House in 2000, and then 2010 I was in the Senate involved with reapportionment then, and so this will be the 3rd time around that I will be involved in the process of reapportionment. It's a very data-driven process. We have certain criteria that we, of course, have to follow. We try to you have to have equal weight, equal population with a variance. Typically it's 2.5% on either side, population variance. In each legislative district, contiguity is an important principle. Incumbency even is a principle that the courts have allowed, although it can't overrule everything else, as far as not putting 2 incumbents in the same district, that you can take that in. That's a factor you can take into account. Of course, the Voting Rights Act applies and controls a lot of the deliberations and decisions that are made. The process is, I found the process, like in 2010, we passed a bipartisan redistricting plan and passed into law without any, well, a judge did not end up drawing the plan anyway. The judicial branch did not anyway, which I think was a function of the manner in which we conducted it, and the input and the bipartisan input and cooperation in drafting that plan coming out of the Senate in 2010. it's also that's the year that the first congressional district also was, it used to go up north from Charleston north to Myrtle Beach. Y'all may remember that in Horry County, and that was flipped, and it goes down, of course, to the south now, Charleston and Dorchester, Berkeley, down to Beaufort County. And that's been my experience with reapportionment. As far as where we are in the Senate, we have not appointed a subcommittee yet. The subcommittee that does redistricting is it's a lot of work, and I've never been on that subcommittee before, and I don't know if I will be this year. But I was very involved, even though I wasn't a subcommittee member in the prior redistrictings that I was involved in. But normally that subcommittee will travel around the state, will get input in different communities. Of course, gets a lot of input from members. We end up hiring staff that have some expertise in here that aren't full-time Senate staff or House staff, because we need some special expertise typically in this when we do this, and we'll do that again, I'm sure, this time around. And we rely heavily on the state demographer, because you have to look at population, where the population has shifted and moved from the most recent census. And that's kind of a summary of the process from a legislative standpoint.
Well, thank you. Do you have anything else that you would like to add to that?
Well, I'll say that in 2010, I was very proud that we ended up doing a reapportionment plan that was bipartisan, and that I can't remember if there might have been some litigation, but at the end of the day, it was the plan itself that was adopted, and the two parties and the Republican and the Democratic caucus in the Senate were in agreement. And so there was no litigation from that standpoint. And I think that is that's a byproduct, I believe, of a more bipartisan sentiment in the Senate. That I think we've lost it a little bit, but not totally by any means. And it's also a byproduct of us. We are used to striking deals in the Senate, particularly when I say strike a deal, everyone gives a little bit and we get something passed, because the rules of the Senate, the rules of every Senate, the US Senate and the South Carolina Senate, vest minorities with significant power and therefore leverage, and therefore it produces a body that is used to working together and striking some agreement. And when you do that on reapportionment, that's a real positive statement, and that's what we did in 2010. I'd like to see us do that again.
And how do you feel that the schedule, can you highlight the schedule, how it's possibly been altered with the delay in receiving the data?
It's definitely altered. When this committee is appointed, it's going to need to work. It's going to need to work this fall when we're out of session, this summer and fall when the General Assembly is not in session. This committee will be doing a good bit of work. And even when you don't have the final census data, there's still some work to do. And it's kind of preparatory work, but there's still work for that subcommittee to do. So hopefully that subcommittee, I'm confident it will be appointed before we adjourn sine die this spring. I'm certain that will happen. It needs to certainly happen by then. And then we'll be working throughout the fall, winter, and into next session.
And could you comment on just some of the different ways that the redistricting process could occur if it were something like an independent commission?
Well, I don't know. I don't have any experience with an independent commission. I do know this. My view is that you have politics and political predilections weigh in on reapportionment. In fact, the framers intended it to be that way. Even the term gerrymandering is from an 1812 district that Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, drew, and one of the pamphleteers back then, I guess it was the equivalent of Twitter, looked at it and said, looked like a salamander, and that's how we got gerrymandering from and even James Monroe tried to gerrymander James Madison out of a congressional district. Both of them become presidents of the United States, but in Virginia tried to gerrymander Madison out right at the very founding and adoption of the Constitution, or immediately after it. And so it's been that way forever. You can't take the politics out of it. The question is, how do you manage the politics? That's been my view, that an independent commission is not going to be independent when it comes to political persuasion. Legislators are not going to be independent when it comes to redistricting. And in fact, the court in 2019 in Ruco v. Common Cause held that redistricting for the courts is really a non-justiciable political question. It kind of acknowledged that the foundation for that had been laid in some previous cases. But the framers understood, we all know just from experience, that it is a inherently political process, to the point where the courts have called it a non-justiciable political question. Now, you can violate it on equal protection grounds and other grounds, but just simply upon taking partisan interest into account, the court says that part of it is non-justiciable. And so with an independent commission, what you don't have is someone who can stand to account for what they did with the voters. When you have the legislature do it, when you have a legislative body that is elected, they do have to account to the voters because they stand for election periodically. But an independent commission does not have that dynamic in play. And the other thing, like what we did in 2010, I would say this, that we are used to striking an agreement with each other. We do it every day, multiple times a day. I was on a Zoom meeting for almost 4 hours today with Dick Harpootli and Brad Hutto, the minority leader, and Chairman Rankin and other members dealing with issues. And we agreed on most things, and that's just, we're used to negotiating with each other. We know we understand the personalities, we understand their fundamental philosophical bents, each other's, and we are capable of doing that. We're used to doing that, and yet we are also held accountable. So when that applies to reapportionment, that same dynamic is at play. It's just an observation that I would suggest that y'all consider when you think in the terms of an independent commission.
Well, I have, we thank you so much for being here. I have just one final question. You referenced sort of the public input component to the redistricting process. Can you elaborate on that? You said people will go around the state. Will there be a one-time presentation in a particular location? Is it multiple times people have a chance to see this presented? Is it a final version that's presented?
It'll be multiple times, and just in the past, we had meetings in different areas of the state, as I recall. Now I'm going by memory. I was not on the reapportionment subcommittee, but that's my recollection, that we had meetings, public meetings, where people could give input. And of course, we had plenty of them in Columbia as well. And so, yeah, there were opportunities for input, and people you know, and the factors, the communities of interest, as best you can follow political subdivision lines. So all those factors as I recall, we were meetings in different parts of the state and hearing from folks from Beaufort County to York County to Greenville, Spartanburg to Horry, and across the whole state, we would get that type of input. So there will be opportunity for that for sure.
Okay, great. And I guess as the schedule unfolds through this process, the public will be made aware of when those events will take place.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I so thank you for joining us this evening. I'm sorry we had a little bit of a delay there getting you on, but thanks so much. We're going to shift to John, back to John again, and pick up where we left off, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you for having
John,
me.
are you here? All right, John, I think we were talking about some local issues, but the next question I have for you is, how will municipalities hold elections in November 2021?
Well, I think we touched
don't
on
have
that.
the date and time. Sorry?
I think we touched on that they're figuring that out right now, whether they will or whether they will delay them. And, that's something that interested citizens should be talking to their municipal bodies about.
So this is something you're seeing going on across the state. I know that there's discussions about possibly delaying, like changing the date of elections, or waiting to the next annual election. Are you seeing that across the state?
I am beginning to see discussions of that across the state. I know there's been a lot in the Charleston area, discussions about what to do with the city of Charleston. I've seen some discussion in Columbia. I'm sure it's going to come up everywhere because, it's an issue.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. In areas with single-member school boards and county council seats, how is it determined if those districts will be the same or drawn separately? Or differently, really?
Yeah, anything that has to do with the election or appointment of school board members is controlled by the legislative delegation. They make those determinations, so it varies from county to county.
Okay.
Exactly, there are places where the school board members are separately redistricted. When I advised Richland County School District 1 in this past go around, the plan they adopted to recommend then had to be adopted by the General Assembly. I've even seen instances where the legislative delegation essentially rammed it through without talking to anyone. The school board found out about it when they saw a discussion of the House member in Union County had with some community folks, and they didn't know they were being redistricted. So it varies jurisdiction to from, I would say county, except some counties, the school board lines flop over the county line, and in others it doesn't, they have several school districts. And so it's whatever the legislative delegation decides, that's what it is.
Okay. What can citizens do to make their voices heard on federal, state, and local levels? I know we have HR 1 and S1, the For the People Act, and we have independent commissions has already been discussed. But what can the average citizen do?
As always, talk to your legislators. And when I say legislators, I don't just mean the folks up at the State House. I also mean, the folks in Congress. HR 1 is now in the Senate, so conversations should be going on with Lindsey Graham and the other fella. You know, even though you may not believe they're going to vote for these, you know, they need to hear that they have citizens who are watching them on this stuff. With legislators, conversations about drawing fair maps, not just doing incumbency protection. With local redistricting, I mean, local redistricting generally happens in the dark. And so it's really important that citizens engage in knowing what's going on with local redistricting for county councils, school boards, city councils, boards of public works, if you have them. You know, the more you get involved in those conversations and the earlier you get involved in them, the more input you will have. The league is, of course, trying to pull together a citizen advisory committee, a redistricting advisory committee that will be made up a bipartisan group with representatives from across the state so that we can, you know, come up with proposals that we'll be introducing and submitting to the General Assembly. So there are lots of ways to have input into the process. The one thing you can guarantee is if you say nothing, they'll do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see as local input in the local redistricting? What you said that might be done sort of in a dark room, but what are the opportunities for local input on?
Well, first figure out what their plans are. When do they plan to do it? And then make sure that there are public hearings on the redistricting plans. Get a hold of a copy of the plans. You know, it's possible to submit alternative plans. I've worked for the NAACP on local redistricting since the early 90s. And we routinely submit alternative plans that do a better job of protecting the rights of African-American citizens. You know, work with your local NAACP branch because they'll be paying attention to these processes too, so that, you know, fair maps can be drawn at all levels.
John, I'm going to share my screen. You provided us with a slide, some maps that you have drawn. And can you speak to these exemplar maps?
Yes. The one on the left is the current map for congressional districts. The one on the right is an exemplar. I was asked by the league team asked me to draw sort of what would we have drawn in 2010 if we were drawing maps in 2010. Applying the criteria that the league favors for redistricting. These are much more compact districts, and the maps, our exemplar maps, are incumbent agnostic. We did not have the addresses of incumbents when I was doing this drawing. You can see this map is, like I say, it's very much more compact. It's much more competitive. District 6 in the current congressional map has a Black voting age population of 55%, but its non-white voting population is closer to 65%, which is far more than is needed to elect a candidate of choice of Black voters in District 6. This particular map has a BVAP of 44% of Black voting age population, but it has a majority minority voting age population. So we have we've developed exemplar maps for the other districts, not because this is necessarily the perfect set of districts, but so that you can see there are other ways to do it that are more consistent with what league members would prefer to see in districting plans.
And are these maps are you incorporating the shift in population that we know is going to be revealed?
Yeah. I'm by training a historian, and this is a historical map. This is
Okay.
what we would have drawn in 2010 using 2010 data.
Okay.
Now, we are beginning to assemble some of the data that allows us to kind of look at where is this going to change, and where it's going to change is there's a lot of population movement to the coast. There's a lot of population movement up towards Charlotte. And if you look at a map with those population shifts mapped on them, there is a crater running up and down I-95. So there are going to be districts lost in the middle of the state that go especially towards the coast, but also up towards Charlotte, some around Greenville, Pickens area.
And we're just showing one map today, but you have many, many maps that are available on the working group blog, I believe. Is that correct, John?
Yes.
And we can find that on the State League's website.
Right. Yeah, we have a House exemplar and a Senate exemplar.
And you mentioned the Redistricting Advisory Committee. Can you just elaborate on that a bit more, that the state redistricting work group is putting together?
Yes, since we can't have an official independent redistricting commission, the leadership of the league has concluded that what we can do is try to assemble the kind of group you would have with an independent redistricting commission. Folks from both sides of the aisles, folks from different parts of the state. And then they will be hearing testimony and considering maps on, one of the things that would be very helpful to us, I know to me as a line drawer, is when we deal with this whole question of communities of interest and how you define communities of interest. One of the things I always say when I do local redistricting is, look, y'all are the experts on your communities. I'm the guy from Columbia with the computer. And so, giving us direction on what you think those communities of interest are would be very helpful. There are lots of places where, I look at it and I said, well, it could be this, it could be that. I don't know. We had a vibrant discussion around our exemplar Senate map that had not every block in Spartanburg, in the city of Spartanburg, in one Senate district, but just about all of them, rather than having it chopped up into 3 districts like it is now. And, we had an interesting discussion about what are the implications of that on something like who controls the water district. And so those sorts of things are very helpful. And if you could be giving real thought to what you want your districts to look like, not just where you think you can elect your friends, but where you think there are cohesive communities of interest that should be recognized in the redistricting process. We would love to have those from you. I had hoped to try to get up an email address that we could use for this, but people could send them to me.
Well, you're giving me an opportunity. I have one more question for you, but the communities of interest is, I'm going to segue after our last question into a call of action related to communities of interest. So I'm glad that you touched upon that. But my last question for you right now, John, is can you speak just briefly about the criteria that the league has developed, the state league has developed for redistricting, and how that might compare to what the legislature is actually abiding, what they will be using as their criteria?
Right. The House and the Senate each adopt their own criteria for redistricting, and they differ somewhat. They differ around their definitions of incumbency protection. The league's criteria are we don't protect incumbents, we don't consider partisan advantage. We are, one of the ways that you can kind of do partisan incumbent protection is by instead saying we're going to protect the core of existing districts. And we don't have that sort of stuff, which is just an excuse for incumbency protection. Again, the voters should be choosing their representatives, not the representatives, their voters. So those are the biggest areas. We have a wider percent deviation that we allow because it allows you to reduce the number of, ours is plus or minus 5%, which is, sort of the de facto constitutional standard for state legislative districts. And that's because it reduces the number of precincts you have to split.
Okay. Well, I know our evening is slowly slipping away from us, but thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your insight. I am going to click on to the next slide is just a brief update on, John had referred to this, but we have HR1, which passed through the House and is now S1 in the Senate, the For the People Act. We really appreciate all the efforts that our members have made to reach out to their House representatives, and now it's time to reach out to our senators, Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott. So that's the update on that. And then quickly, I'm going to go to our call to action. So John set us up for this. We couldn't have arranged it better. He talked about communities of interest. And what we want to do for our call of action is have you, each of you, look up your district numbers, find out where you are in your district area, how many district members there are. It could be we're talking about your House district right now as a starting point, but you're certainly welcome to look up any of your single member districts. Study the map of your district. Find it on the South Carolina Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office website. How might the district lines impact the representation you get as a constituent? And then draw your own communities of interest using this tool, Representable. And then you can submit that communities of interest information to us. We will be following this up with an email that will give you all the links that you need. But we would love for you to put this into motion and think a lot about your districts and your communities of interest because they matter. And as John mentioned, he's very interested in learning about that information. We are already at 7:22. And I think, Shana, I think we're deciding that we may be running out of time for Q&A. I think we're going to thank our members for our guests who have participated, but I can let John and Ruth, and I don't know if Senator Campson's still with us, if you'd like to say some parting thoughts, I think we could probably do that. I don't think we'll have time for questions. Ruth, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually really liked Senator Campson's presentation, and I looked up the scores for the House and Senate while he was speaking, and it really does seem as though they went through a fairly bipartisan process last time. Now that can lead to, you know, lack of competition and other problems. I still think the congressional districts are a little problematic, but I think you have a good tool in somebody who will turn up and speak to these issues at your event, and you obviously have, you know, garnered together this great community. So I feel like I am certainly leaving this evening feeling a little more hopeful that, you know, you all being involved and doing things like using Representable to draw communities of interest, and having you know, John's just amazing skill. I think you guys are going to be okay. You just need to like keep at it. I feel a lot more positive than coming out of many states I've spoken with. So yeah, good luck.
Well, thank you. John, do you have any parting thoughts?
Well, you know, just to reiterate, this will be as good as we make it. And if they're not going to directly provide the tools for citizen line drawing, then we just simply need to engage it ourselves and do organizing around it. I know the league will be submitting maps when we get to that. Other groups will be submitting maps, and we need to push them not to just go into a dark room and cut a deal somewhere that keeps all of them happy.
And I guess the best way for that is for all of us to also request that public input
Yes.
part of it, so that we can be engaged and attentive and ask questions along with all the league's effort. But as individuals, we can keep our eye on the prize, I guess. I don't know that Senator Campson is still on with us. He's welcome to make a final comment, but I think maybe he has gone. Well, I would just like to say thank you so much for all of you who are attending tonight. Let's see, I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. All attendees will be receiving a follow-up email, as I mentioned, that will have the call to action information and corresponding links. We are, on the behalf of the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Remember that call to action. Remember, the next event is April 12th on the Electoral College and Institutional Reform. We'd love to see you there, and have a great night. Thanks so much.